So Ukraine just eliminated 2 more Russian helicopters as they continue to adjust their drone tactics to continue the destruction of Russian air defense and aircraft in Crimea. And Russia's noticing this, talking about this change of tactics and what they're doing to try to keep up. On top of that, we have a Russian nationalist, Igor Girkin, who says the conditions right now look very similar to February 1917. That was a Russian revolution, so not a good sign there for Russia, unless they make some changes that Girkin suggests. So diving into what we know, we talked a couple days ago about some drone strikes in Crimea. They are continuing and arguably increasing in tempo. The GUR put out this footage saying another phantom strike on the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea. Good drones hit the Russian invaders' airbase near Simferopol, successfully destroying 2 enemy Mi-8 helicopters. The estimated cost of the disabled helicopters is between $20 and $30 million. An unfortunate fate also befell the Moscow military tug in Sevastopol Bay during an airstrike against the invaders in the peninsula. The raid boat is part of an underwater sabotage force, which is a unit of highly qualified diver scouts whose training requires significant financial and time resources as well as the best equipment. The damage to the tug significantly limits the combat capabilities of this elite Russian unit. But on top of this, we saw a bunch of footage come out just in recent days. We have another clip here from the night of August 28th, where the GUR said they went after a Russian radar complex from the S-400 air defense system. Then on the 31st, a couple days after that, we had even more footage coming out of the GUR showing once again the systematic targeting of Russian air defense assets across Crimea. And it's not a shock that this is happening. In fact, Russian mill blogger 2 Majors keyed in on this in a recent post saying, quote, "In the past few days, the enemy has released several footages of strikes on Crimean territory involving the Phantom's special unit. Based on their choice of targets, it can be concluded that the enemy is trying to knock out our air defense positional areas. Moreover, the primary targets of the attacks are not launchers, but radars and other detection means. If the radars, essentially the eyes, are destroyed, it will become impossible to detect a flying drone or aircraft, and this is exactly what the Ukrainian formations are focusing on. For the Ukrainian regime, it is extremely important to weaken the defense in the western part of the peninsula, as Ukraine does not hide its intentions to conduct a large-scale operation in the Black Sea direction. The attacks aim to weaken the defense ahead of an escalation. Considering the intensity of the attacks in August, the armed forces of Ukraine are likely entering the final stage of preparation." So a couple things to keep in mind here. First off, the cost and the time that it takes to build air defense radars is no joke. So that is a short supply item. I don't know exactly how long it takes to churn those out, but it's certainly not faster than the rate at which Ukraine is destroying those in Crimea. And for every one of those that's destroyed, you have the possibility of opening a gap in the Russian air defense network. These radars, as we're going to hear from Fighter Bomber, another Russian mill blogger here in a moment, are very good at picking up missiles, aircraft, and large drones. Really bad or not capable of picking up smaller drones. So Ukraine is utilizing some of these smaller drones at times, FPVs and even quadcopters serving as bombers, to destroy these radar systems and open up the airspace for the possibility of some sort of future action. We have to have a couple things in mind right now. The new ERAM munition, the air-launched extended-range munition being provided by the United States. Some of those are supposed to be arriving in theater any day now. We know that Ukraine just rolled out their Flamingo, long-distance, very large cruise missile, domestically manufactured. It could be opening up the airspace for that. Possible, but very low probability, is that they could be opening the airspace for Ukrainian fixed-wing or rotary-wing aircraft. Again, I put that very low down the list of probabilities. I would more likely expect to see Ukraine utilize these gaps in airspace to push large munitions through, maybe even ATACMS or Storm Shadows, to go after some more strategic Russian targets and big picture make life untenable, or try to make life untenable for the Russian forces in Crimea. Russian mill blogger Fighter Bomber talked about these changing tactics, where he says they have shifted, the Ukrainians, from using large, long-endurance, slow, and easily detected fixed-wing drones with relatively heavy warheads to using sabotage groups and recruited civilians with small UAVs. I want to note that we haven't seen a lot of confirmation of that. Some of the footage that we're getting out of Crimea, some of it we know to have been, or at least Ukraine announced, that these were USV-launched drones. So small drones being launched off of larger drones operating in the Black Sea. We have seen some mothership-type drones utilized, as in large fixed-wing drones, both with Russia and Ukraine, dropping off shorter-range FPV drones when they're near a target. There's been a lot of speculation about civilians and sabotage groups being utilized. At this point, I haven't seen any evidence, especially when it comes to, the quality of these drones being utilized in Crimea. The feed here is very high quality. This is probably not something that people are assembling together in their basements from spare parts. So maybe it is sabotage groups. I just haven't seen a lot of evidence at this point that it is not just continued work by the GUR launching these drones from Ukrainian territory. Fighter bomber continues by saying, actually, damage to equipment today is inflicted not only by FPV drones and small fixed-wing drones, but also by drops from drones. Grenades dropping out of, and we saw that from the 73rd Special Operations Group a few months ago, where they utilized drone drop munitions over air defense assets in Crimea. He says basically all of this is too small of a target for the Pantsir system, making it a difficult target. How do we deal with fiber optic drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras is still unknown. Let me remind you that the perimeter of an average airfield is 40 kilometers. The size of an FPV drone is 17 centimeters. The stupid enemy, for some reason, does not strike aviation equipment in shelters because there is plenty of it outside. It's clear that we will come up with something here too. The question is at what cost and how soon. So again, you're watching a cat and mouse game play out in real time. We have seen Russia start to develop and build out more shelters for their aircraft anywhere within drone range of Ukraine. And they are not 100% complete there, not by a long shot. What Fighter Bomber continues to complain about is even as those shelters are built, and it makes it harder or impossible for a drone drop munition or maybe even an FPV drone to have any effect on that target, they just look to their left and right and find helicopters sitting out in the open or radar systems that are still vulnerable. Essentially, plenty of targets for Ukraine to continue to go after. Now, I do want to shift over to some battlefield updates here, but first, a quick announcement. We did just yesterday roll out our Patreon program. The link is in the description below for anybody interested and able in participating. What we're doing there are ad-free, sponsor-free videos. We've got some patron-only videos that'll be coming out there, and then AMA or Q&A sessions, trying to put those out pretty regularly. We'll probably do the first one here in a couple days, and then we're asking patrons for any questions they have for interviews that are coming up, and a couple of those are listed there as well. So if interested and able to participate, that link is in the description below. Now, turning over to some battlefield updates, Ukrainian President Zelensky put out a bit of an assessment here a couple days ago where he said he just had a report by Commander Syrsky, commander of Ukrainian ground forces, the Ukrainian military, where he said, first of all, on the Pokrovsk direction, where the Russian army is concentrating its greatest efforts and accordingly suffering the greatest losses. Our units continue to carry out the assigned tasks in Donetsk and methodically destroy the occupier. Overall, along the front line in just 8 months of this year, the Russians have lost more than 290,000 of their military personnel, killed and seriously wounded. They suffered the greatest losses precisely in Donetsk, failing to achieve any of their strategic objectives. On some sections of the front, our stabilization measures are currently ongoing. That failure to achieve any strategic objectives, I don't think can be argued at this point. Where you will see people start to argue that is they will say, hey, this is a war of attrition, so territory doesn't matter. The attrition is the means that the war is being fought. So you could have a maneuver-style warfare like we largely saw on the Western Front in World War II, generally how the United States has fought wars, especially the opening of the war in Iraq, for instance. It's what Russia wanted to fight in Ukraine. They were not able to do that. They got bogged down, and in turn, they are forced to fight a war of attrition, trying to slowly degrade the Ukrainian military. That is not the ideal situation, not by a long shot. In a perfect world, you outmaneuver the enemy and then they surrender and overall casualties are pretty low. That is a possibility when one side significantly outmatches the other. So the strategic objectives have not been achieved in Ukraine, not by a long shot. And we're seeing that continue to play out now. In fact, we have an update here in a moment talking about just how much territory was gained by Russia in August, and it was actually a decrease from July. They've, in some ways, kind of slowed the pace of their operations over the course of the last month. In some ways. Some more details there that are kind of important. President Zelensky continued by saying, "We have thoroughly analyzed the situation in the Zaporozhye direction and the occupiers' intentions, also the situation on the border of the Sumy and Kharkiv region. We will continue our active actions exactly as needed to defend Ukraine. Forces and means are prepared. New deep strikes have also been planned." Interested to see what that means when he says new deep strikes have been planned, because deep strikes have not stopped, not for a long time. Ukraine has increased the tempo, the range, and the intensity of their strikes inside of Russian territory. So for the president to come out and say new ones are planned, I don't know if that means a different target set, perhaps a lot of oil and gas and airfield focus in the last couple months, maybe a different type of munition. Again, maybe that Flamingo makes an appearance, or something else entirely. Now, we did get a video just earlier today showing the clearing of Udachny in Donetsk, and this is an interesting area. I'll play this video here. This is one of the areas that plays into this next assessment from the Blackbird Group, an incredible analyst. They publish over on X, and they have a website. I'll link all of that in the description below. They put a thread together explaining how August actually saw kind of an increase in activity, but a decrease in operational gains by Russia. And this video here, the clearing of Udachny, my apologies in the pronunciation, kind of is exactly what they're talking about. This is an area, small little piece of land that Russia at one point took, quote. They had people there, they put up some flags, and maps started to reflect that Russia had taken that territory. But it was very few forces there at all, and it did not even take a significant deployment of Ukrainian forces to enter that area, clear it out, and say this is now Ukrainian territory again. So we've seen a lot of that. As the Ukrainian lines have become thinner and thinner, we're seeing a lot more fluidity all across the front, and that's what Blackbird Group gets at here. Again, this entire assessment, it's great thread, will be linked in the description below. They say in August, the Russians occupied 430 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. This is down from the 502 square kilometers in July. However, looking at the numbers alone does not give a full picture of the Russian operations. Over the second half of August, the situation became increasingly dynamic. This was the breakthrough at Pokrovsk, is kind of how that was being framed. He said in the area of the Dnipro border, the Ukrainians conducted a tactical counterattack, pushing Russia away from 50 square kilometers of territory. The area in orange, showing some of their graphics here, was our assessment, the Blackbird Group assessment, of Russian control on the 15th of August, overlaid on current front lines. In the Dobropolia direction, the Russians managed to breach the Ukrainian front up to a depth of 16 kilometers, and Ukraine was forced to divert forces from other sectors to prevent a breakthrough. Assessed Ukrainian control on the 16th in purple, Russia in orange, current assessment in red and blue. Without an operational level response from Ukraine, the Russians may have consolidated their gains in a much larger area. Positions changing hands is not new. It happens constantly, but the scale of the back and forth we saw in August was uncommon for this point in the war. And as a reminder, what we saw largely to our understanding now is gaps in the Ukrainian lines. They're more and more relying on the use of drones to spot large Russian elements trying to break through. What that has allowed is small groups of Russians, 1, 2, 3 at a time, to probe their way forward with the assistance of drones overhead, identify gaps in the line, and start to mass forces at some point behind the Ukrainian line of control. Ideally there, from the Russian perspective, they eventually break out and they're able to harass Ukrainian positions, force drone units or logistics units to pull back even further, maybe put at risk Ukrainian supply lines, things like that. What we saw north of Pokrovsk was that Ukraine redeployed a number of units, largely units that were set up in reserve or QRF status, like Azov, 93rd Mechanized, and some others. But it does look like they pulled some units from other sectors of the front to come down, sweep through, clear that area out, and kind of reestablish the lines as they were. Blackbird Group says, quote, "Thus downward trend in gains from July is not necessarily indicative of Russian offensive operations winding down, but rather of successful Ukrainian tactical and operational responses to Russian advances throughout the second half of the month. As the front becomes more porous, it's possible that dynamics like these become more common, even as the Russian operations continue at a similar pace. At the same time, the Russian forces failed to make any significant operational gains over the summer months. This lack of results over the summer likely led to the reorganization and repositioning of forces over the last weeks of July, happening simultaneously with Ukrainian counterattacks. It's likely that Russian operations continue with largely similar tempo into the autumn. And we are seeing a number of accounts start to report a massing of Ukrainian units, a massing of Russian units in the Pokrovsk direction, suggesting that they might try one more big push here in the next couple weeks or months before we actually get to winter. So as we've been watching Pokrovsk for over a year now, it does look like it's going to continue to be the focus of Russian offensive operations. Now, it's not just Ukrainian-aligned groups that are saying that Russia has not achieved any strategic objectives this summer. The same is coming from Igor Girkin, a Russian nationalist former commander who was jailed and is now on house arrest for being critical of Russia. So we always have to take what he says with a grain of salt. One note, this is a man that wants Russia to win, and he's been pretty consistent. Love him or hate him. Then look, he's a war criminal, all right? But he's been very, very consistent in what he says Russia needs to do to win the war, and he's sticking with that here. Where he says, quote, "On the front, a sluggish but very bloodily push and pull continues. Our offensive has not reached any level of operational success by the beginning of August, and the enemy's counteroffensive, which many, including myself, expect and predict, has not yet begun." We've reported on that recently. Girkin is one of the only ones I've seen talking about how Ukraine is putting together some sort of large counteroffensive this fall. I'm not seeing that really anywhere else. It's not clear exactly where that might be. The most I could say is maybe trying to straighten out the lines in some of these cauldrons, like Pokrovsk, maybe Liman in the east, Izium area. I don't know. There's not a lot of talk about Ukrainian offensive ops outside of Girkin. He says the exchange of blows is also unable to change the situation on a strategic scale. The Ukrainians do not have enough strength to destroy our economic rear, and we have no opportunity to strike the enemy's deep rear because they're outside of the so-called Ukraine. As in, a lot of Ukrainian logistics are coming from their allies, being staged in Poland and elsewhere around the world before they flow into Ukraine. He says, of course, both sides hope that the enemy will end sooner and that they will hold out until victory, and both have some grounds for this, but I keep repeating, there can be no compromise in this war, and for us to win, very serious efforts must be made. What he's talking about with those serious efforts, by and large, is the mobilization of the country and a full move to a wartime economy. He looks at what Russia is doing right now, and his view is generally that Putin and the Russian elite are doing everything they can to make sure that the average Russian citizen does not feel the impact of this war. And that can be everything from economic disruptions to actually mobilizing Russian people and prioritizing instead, as they are right now, people from some of the poor regions of Russia. He's saying everyone, call up everyone. Let's get this thing over with. He says if they don't do that, there's a very high probability that we will eventually be squeezed out, not only economically, but also militarily. If the economic crisis of the peacetime economy, which we have now, under the burden of a heavy war continues, together with defeats on the front and war fatigue among the population, then it is easy and very likely that February 1917 may repeat. February 1917 was the Russian Revolution, pretty bloody time in Russia's history. So Girkin, for his part, always dooming, always alarmist, so take that with a grain of salt. But he looks at the increase, the possibility of Ukraine kicking off some sort of offensive operation to achieve victories in the battlefield, along with the war weariness of the Russian population. If that is paired with increased economic sanctions or tariffs or something on the Russian economy, he sees this situation kind of repeating that we saw a little over 100 years ago, and no doubt could be catastrophic for Putin and Russia. Again, he tends to have some of the more alarmist takes, but I feel like every so often it's worth bringing those up. That's all we got for now. Again, for anybody interested, we've got the Patreon program linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.